The Basin Psalms. For Lottie Consalvo. John Bernys. Part 1. Within cells interlinked, I laid under the drip's monologue and split from sleep. Within cells interlinked, I watched her bones dissolve across my forehead. Within cells interlinked, I counted seconds in stalacities of sorrow. Within cells interlinked, I hear her whisper, crack the ceiling spine. Within cells interlinked, I offered my skull to each falling droplet's psalm. Within cells interlinked, I drowned in the stillness of that unbearable mercy. Within cells interlinked, I mouthed her name until the tiles steamed. Within cells interlinked, I lived inside her absence like a shroud of glass. Within cells interlinked, I remembered her shoulder by the sink. Within cells interlinked, I begged the water to give me her last words. Within cells interlinked, I felt psychosis brush past me like her wind-wed coat. Within cells interlinked, I became the echo chamber of grief's architecture. Within cells interlinked, I scratched notes on the floor in the language of ache. Within cells interlinked, I knew the mind was more physical than breath. Within cells interlinked, I welcomed the breaking point like a sister returning. Within cells interlinked, I hallucinated a pulse beside mine in the dark. Within cells interlinked, I saw her feet under the bed frame and wept. Within cells interlinked, I baptized my forehead in each bruise of memory. Within cells interlinked, I caught the drip mid-fall in a scream I never released. Within cells interlinked, I buried her again and again in the silence between drops. Within cells interlinked, I felt time rot like wet linen around the skull. Within cells interlinked, I carved her profile into the back of my mind. Within cells interlinked, I begged for relief and got revelation. Within cells interlinked, I folded the pain into paper ships and let them float. Within cells interlinked, I heard her cough in the plumbing and it shattered me. Within cells interlinked, I waited for a voice that wouldn't uncoil. Within cells interlinked, I cracked my knuckles like cracking the door to the beyond. Within cells interlinked, I watched the ceiling flicker with static mourning. Within cells interlinked, I saw her reflection blink inside the puddles of myself. Within cells interlinked, I swallowed dread like communion wine from the basin. Within cells interlinked, I drifted toward her until I was her. Within cells interlinked, I forgot where the pain started and I ended. Within cells interlinked, I split into two women, one grieving, one gone. Within cells interlinked, I counted drips instead of days. Within cells interlinked, I wept until I was water, was pulse, was presence. Within cells interlinked, I forgot the world above, the faucet's breath. Within cells interlinked, I screamed into the basin and heard her moan back. Within cells interlinked, I dreamt the ship would steady, but it only sank. Within cells interlinked, I lay married to madness and wet concrete. Within cells interlinked, I knew she wasn't dead, just displaced into the mind's. Within cells interlinked, I kissed her ghost in the mirror and bit my tongue through. Within cells interlinked, I collapsed into the leak like it was home. Within cells interlinked, I said I would not rise until the water stopped. Within cells interlinked, I waited for release, forgiveness, thunder, anything. Within cells interlinked, I understood the body is nothing but a mind with limbs. Within cells interlinked, I broke like dawn through her absence, and it burned. Part 2. Within cells interlinked, I licked iron from the floor and called it resurrection. Within cells interlinked, I counted vertebrae in shadows that were never mine. Within cells interlinked, I blinked wrong and saw her on the ceiling, face slack with sleep. Within cells interlinked, I mapped my grief in droplets across the wall. Within cells interlinked, I sang backwards to remember her in pre-death. Within cells interlinked, I begged the water to be sharper, to speak louder, to end. Within cells interlinked, I floated in place and called it travel. Within cells interlinked, I saw her standing, ankle-deep in hallucinated rain. Within cells interlinked, I watched my nails curl up like dried petals in morning. Within cells interlinked, I grew veins of rust along my temples and thanked the faucet. Within cells interlinked, I tried to scream her name, but all that came out was tap water. Within cells interlinked, I folded her final words into the drain with both hands. Within cells interlinked, I opened my mouth to speak and inhaled her instead. Within cells interlinked, I forgot what it meant to live without needing pain. Within cells interlinked, I chanted the litany of loss until the tiles joined in. Within cells interlinked, I offered my head to the leak like a reliquary. Within cells interlinked, I rubbed my eyes and saw her scrawling grief onto the grout. Within cells interlinked, I asked her why, and she pointed at the ceiling. Within cells interlinked, I pierced my thoughts with each drop, like acupuncture from the dead. Within cells interlinked, I traced the tracks in the wall, like fault lines in my memory. Within cells interlinked, I envisioned her breathless in the corner, watching. Within cells interlinked, I remembered the softness of her voice under fluorescent rage. Within cells interlinked, I stitched her silhouette into my breath and choked on it. Within cells interlinked, I screamed once and the building flinched. Within cells interlinked, I walked through my skull and found her brushing her hair. Within cells interlinked, I carved forgiveness into my inner eye with a fingernail. Within cells interlinked, I let the flood carry me back to her laugh. Within cells interlinked, I wondered how many drops equal atonement. Within cells interlinked, I let grief fossilize inside my lungs. Within cells interlinked, I kissed the back of her imagined hand and swallowed dirt. Within cells interlinked, I asked the water if I was allowed to leave. Within cells interlinked, I answered the question she never asked by bleeding again. Within cells interlinked, I remembered her in slices, eyes, knees, a smile like shame. Within cells interlinked, I woke in the middle of the performance and cried blood. Within cells interlinked, I let the psychosis bloom into petals shaped like her. Within cells interlinked, I listened for her footsteps, but only heard the tick of madness. Within cells interlinked, I turned to salt and spilled across the tiles like an offering. Within cells interlinked, I buried myself beside her name and marked it with silence. Within cells interlinked, I let the torture become prayer, and prayer become surrender. Within cells interlinked, I promised to remember her every time I wash my face. Within cells interlinked, I imagined her fingers threading mine through the drip. Within cells interlinked, I asked the water if she forgave me, and the faucet coughed. Within cells interlinked, I stayed down long enough to forget I had a body. Within cells interlinked, I invited death to dinner, and only ghosts arrived. Within cells interlinked, I saw her blink once, and then she was vapor again. Within cells interlinked, I hear her speak inside my ear canal and shook. Within cells interlinked, I asked for mercy, and got reflection. Part 3. Within cells interlinked, I poured the flood through my sinuses and let it rewrite my voice. Within cells interlinked, I watched her braid her hair in the mirror of my breakdown. Within cells interlinked, I crushed aspirin with my teeth like ritual ash. Within cells interlinked, I called the hospital, but no one answered in my dialect of mourning. Within cells interlinked, I turned my mind into a wet cave to house her. Within cells interlinked, I slipped out of my skull to let her lie there instead. Within cells interlinked, I cupped the faucet's rhythm like it was her fading heartbeat. Within cells interlinked, I scratched out the names of the living and wrote hers in. Within cells interlinked, I tasted light like dust stirred by memory's broom. Within cells interlinked, I stitched her name into the lining of my sleep. Within cells interlinked, I closed my eyes and saw her run through the drip. Within cells interlinked, I fell through the drain into a room we used to share. Within cells interlinked, I burned my tongue saying, "I'm sorry," to the ceiling. Within cells interlinked, I danced with her in psychosis under fluorescent thunder. Within cells interlinked, I hallucinated her humming an elegy inside my throat. Within cells interlinked, I peeled my identity like wallpaper, and she was underneath. Within cells interlinked, I chanted each drop like it was a step toward her arms. Within cells interlinked, I felt the ghost of guilt pull my jaw open and fill it with salt. Within cells interlinked, I saw her on the floor next to me, blinking, then gone. Within cells interlinked, I knelt in front of nothing and called it a monument. Within cells interlinked, I let the water knead me into raw clay. Within cells interlinked, I turned my fingers into relics by holding grief too long. Within cells interlinked, I remembered her joke about drowning and how hard I'd laughed. Within cells interlinked, I sang the plumbing open and she poured out screaming. Within cells interlinked, I let my skull echo with the cathedral of her silence. Within cells interlinked, I begged the pipe to become a mouth that could answer. Within cells interlinked, I soaked through the mattress of memory and surfaced choking. Within cells interlinked, I carved her absence into the basin's rim. Within cells interlinked, I counted her freckles in the tile grout and missed one. Within cells interlinked, I broke my own mind just to feel her touch. Within cells interlinked, I watched myself split like lightning between ribs. Within cells interlinked, I heard her breathing in my thoughts and couldn't look. Within cells interlinked, I lifted my face to the leak and let it baptize the fracture. Within cells interlinked, I felt her hand inside my hand, inside the water. Within cells interlinked, I screamed her name into the drain, and it never came back. Within cells interlinked, I dragged myself through mental sewers toward her voice. Within cells interlinked, I let the torture strip me into something worth forgiving. Within cells interlinked, I painted my grief onto the shower wall and called it resurrection. Within cells interlinked, I welcomed each drop like the hand of God and called it hers. Within cells interlinked, I climbed the scaffolding of memory and fell on purpose. Within cells interlinked, I threw a funeral for my sanity and no one noticed. Within cells interlinked, I drank the hallucination like medicine. Within cells interlinked, I traced her laughter in the water's hiss and followed. Within cells interlinked, I dissolved into echo. Part 4. Within cells interlinked, I slipped between each drip like entering time through a crack. Within cells interlinked, I spoke her name until it peeled paint. Within cells interlinked, I imagined her hands squeezing mine in warning. Within cells interlinked, I baptized guilt in porcelain and prayed for amnesia. Within cells interlinked, I watched her drown in my memory and couldn't lift her. Within cells interlinked, I stitched my regrets into her hair, strand by strand. Within cells interlinked, I asked the ceiling how to grieve, and it answered in rust. Within cells interlinked, I fed the void my voice, and it grew teeth. Within cells interlinked, I tasted mold in my mouth and called it her apology. Within cells interlinked, I saw my reflection flinch when I said, "I forgive you." Within cells interlinked, I let the hallucination braid my neurons into a noose. Within cells interlinked, I called the wet silence a god and let it judge me. Within cells interlinked, I watched the water stall and feared it had healed. Within cells interlinked, I heard her giggle behind the faucet and turned to salt. Within cells interlinked, I offered my last sane thought as a dowry to her ghost. Within cells interlinked, I wore her absence like a corset and cinched it tighter. Within cells interlinked, I remembered our childhood through a crack in the grout. Within cells interlinked, I bled into the drain, and the drain sighed like her breath. Within cells interlinked, I found myself talking to shadows that answered in her cadence. Within cells interlinked, I touched the tiles and saw her face ripple across them. Within cells interlinked, I asked her to haunt me, and she did. Within cells interlinked, I measured my guilt in milliliters, in minutes, in echoes. Within cells interlinked, I named each drop after a failure and still ran out of names. Within cells interlinked, I carved scripture into the floor with my spine. Within cells interlinked, I felt her touch as madness and craved it anyway. Within cells interlinked, I boiled my memories in bathwater and drank them. Within cells interlinked, I cracked my ribs open for her to rest in. Within cells interlinked, I broke the mirror and found her waiting in every shard. Within cells interlinked, I turned grief into ritual, and ritual into delirium. Within cells interlinked, I laid still enough for the dead to mistake me as one of them. Within cells interlinked, I tried to walk away, and she pulled my shadow back. Within cells interlinked, I fell asleep to the rhythm of her sobs in the faucet. Within cells interlinked, I begged to forget, but remembered too violently. Within cells interlinked, I sang into my fist until it shook with her voice. Within cells interlinked, I watched the drip stop and screamed. Within cells interlinked, I knew she was behind me and didn't turn around. Within cells interlinked, I curled against the tub and pressed my mouth to tile. Within cells interlinked, I let her last word echo until it replaced thought. Within cells interlinked, I said I would let go, and lied. Within cells interlinked, I pressed my forehead into the leak and saw light. Within cells interlinked, I saw her in the room again, and this time didn't blink. Within cells interlinked, I tasted forgiveness, but couldn't swallow. Within cells interlinked, I broke the loop by calling her name with joy. Within cells interlinked, I waited for the madness to return and missed it. Within cells interlinked, I stood up, dripping raw, remade. Within cells interlinked, I whispered goodbye into the rusted spout. Within cells interlinked, I opened the door and let the world back in. Within cells interlinked, I stepped into a silence she no longer haunted. Within cells interlinked, I looked in the mirror and didn't see her. Within cells interlinked, I breathed without apology. Within cells interlinked, I mourned without spectacle. Within cells interlinked, I walked out the performance and left her behind. Within cells interlinked, I stood blinking in daylight, knowing nothing. Within cells interlinked, I stepped into absolute reality.